It has been 2 years since I started this channel to tackle my backlog while making videos on each and every one of them. That journey has led me to complete over 50 games, all of which I'll be ranking one by one in this video. I'll explain why each game lands at its position as we go, but before we get into that, thank you to those who subscribe to this channel and pushed me over 20,000 subscribers, and thank you to channel members who support this channel. Now, let's get into it. So I've made a video like this once before, and since I've played many games since then, my rankings will likely shift, but at the very bottom of the list, as you might expect, we have Mindseye. Mindseye holds a special place in my heart because it became my most viewed video on this channel, but the game itself is nothing short of terrible. Bugs are prevalent at literally every step, crashes happening left and right, terrible performance, bad story that seems like it was written by ChatGPT, and completely broken enemy AI. I mean, everything that you would not want in a video game makes an appearance. I almost didn't make the video on it because I was having such a tough time making it through. Mindseye never claimed to be the next GTA, but the comparisons ended up cropping up either way when it was getting closer and closer to release. What we're left with was a game that needed at least another year in development, and I'm being generous. I try to find at least one redeeming quality even in some of the worst games I've played, and I guess the fire and smoke effects look good, but I'm scraping the very bottom of the barrel here. Mindseye was a massive flop. The game seems to have received some updates here and there, but nothing looks substantial, and with layoffs happening at the studio time and time again, I highly doubt we'll ever see a Mindseye 2. Mindseye is by far the worst game I played on this channel. Up next, we have Immortal Unchained. There's maybe 5 people who've heard of this game. As we know, games in the Souls-like genre come in all different flavors, but the flavor of this particular game was a mixture of bleach and orange soda. Immortal Unchained is the most unbalanced, depressing, difficult Souls-like I've ever had the displeasure of experiencing. The game tries to adapt the Souls-like formula, but basically with using guns, which sounds like a pretty neat idea, but fails at about every step of the way. Horrible and confusing level design that is an absolute pain to navigate, terrible and muddy looking graphics, and just an overall miserable experience that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I can't even remember why I decided to play the game, but it was just sitting in my backlog staring at me, and I distinctly remember thinking to myself, well, I doubt many people have played this game, so let me check it out. Maybe it's gonna be a diamond in the rough. I regretted every moment of that. The twist at the end is probably the only thing that was worthwhile, but honestly, I don't think I had a worse time playing any other game. The only reason it's above Mindseye is because I wasn't dealing with bugs every other second. Up next, we have Redfall, one of Xbox's biggest missteps and the game that single-handedly caused Arcane Austin to shutter its doors for good. What was meant to be a 4-player looter shooter at the height of that genre's popularity ended up being a game that was released in a state that was so buggy and so broken that it felt almost unplayable. I revisited the game to check it out, and everything is just plain bad, or average at best. The story was told through these screenshots and small bits. The AI would often be completely unaware of what was happening, making gunfights ridiculously easy, and the overall loop of the game got boring very quickly. It was incredibly uninspired and clearly something Microsoft just wanted to get out of the door. They were far too gone and likely invested too much money to just cancel it. I honestly think they were better off not releasing the game at all, but here we are. People lose jobs, studios shut down, and it's just a number on Microsoft's balance sheet. Despite all that, I feel like the game actually had a solid setting and premise, but everything else was a complete letdown. I do wish this game ended up better for the sake of Arcane Austin. Up next, we have Saints Row, the Saints Row written for the modern audience. Longtime fans probably had hypes for the reboot because I know I sure did, at least up until that first trailer was released. The game continues its quirky and non-serious tone, but doesn't do anything special, like at all. Okay, actually the character creator is pretty solid, but other than that, the game is just bad. AI issues, performance issues, a terrible nonsensical story with bad jokes, and one that is clearly written for a specific audience to enjoy. Bad mission design that quickly gets repetitive, a boring and bland city with little to do and see. It just goes on and on. I'm not sure what the future of this franchise will be since the IP is up in the air, but I truly hope if there is another Saints Row game that it is done correctly. Up next, we have Skull and Bones, Ubisoft's attempt at an epic pirate adventure. If I'm not mistaken, this game has now gone free to play for everyone to try out. Either way, the game itself wasn't the worst. Some of the ship fighting mechanics were actually pretty cool. It really just comes down to hitting the weak spots on a ship, but there are a ton of different weapons to use, and the water looked decent, but everything else about this game didn't really do much for me. The single player experience was long and grindy, the UI was confusing, the activities to do were repetitive, and the fact that you're largely tied to your boat is just a strange decision. They could have gone with the Sea of Thieves route, maybe implementing some sort of swordplay, but instead all of that is simply non-existent. I don't know what the future updates for this game will look like, but it will need some really hefty additions to attract a new player base. Knowing Ubisoft though, this game will live on for many years to come. At this point of the list, the rest of the games are decent. I did my best to rank them by how much I personally enjoyed them. Up next, we have Forspoken. Yes, Twitter's favorite game leading up to its release. I'll be honest, the game is not really all that good given its position on the list, but believe it or not, it does in fact have a couple of redeeming qualities that made the playthrough not so completely painful. Before I get into that, the biggest issues with the game are unfortunately very critical. Firstly, the writing, as we all know, is borderline unbearable at times. It has an extremely long introduction that takes hours to give the player any sort of freedom, which almost made me drop the game before even getting started. I think the open world itself is also pretty bland. It's just a bunch of gray and brown all over the place. There's nothing about this game that made me want to continue to push forward. But I did say there are some good things, and that's mainly rooted in the game's combat and movement system. It's extremely fluid and dynamic, the combat is fun and chaotic, the magic system that underlines it all is pretty impressive as well. The effects become more grand as you become more skilled in each school of magic, which is a nice touch. It was fun enough to carry me through the 18 to 20 hours I spent with the game. Up next, we have Atlas Fallen, from one talking gauntlet to another. Atlas Fallen is your quintessential AA game. It doesn't do anything outstanding, but it does everything just enough. The story itself, of course, is kind of bland. The voice acting is particularly bad, and the writing doesn't do that any favors. What separates Atlas Fallen, just like Forspoken, is the game's combat system. It's heavily reliant on its risk and reward mechanics. At any point in a fight, a meter builds up as you deal damage. The more you deal, the greater that meter grows, and once it caps out, you can unleash a tier 3 skill, which is the most devastating damage-wise. The risk here is the simple fact that getting hit takes a chunk off the meter, as well as your health. It's a pretty cool system. Outside of that, the game is just painfully average. The open world is bland, and sure, the sand surfing mechanic to get around is unique, but it doesn't make it any more fun to trek through. The game has had a number of updates and patches that has put it in a better place, but for me, it sits perfectly in its spot on this list. Up next, we have Darksiders 3. I know I'm gonna catch some flack for this from the Darksiders fanbase, but it is what it is. The Darksiders franchise has a ton of ups and downs, and by that, I mean you'll see the other titles of that franchise further down the list. Darksiders 3 is by far the worst of the bunch. The third game switches it up and follows a Souls-like formula rather than the series' typical approach to gameplay. That means there's a currency you collect to level up by killing enemies, and the objective of this particular game is to kill the 7 deadly sins, which are all these huge epic boss fights basically. The problem I had with this game was that it just wasn't good. The narrative was extremely weak in comparison to the first and second game. Fury, who is the main character of this title, isn't really involved in the meta story of the entire franchise. She's kind of off on her own, attempting to do her bidding for the Charred Council. That's fine, but the game just feels so uninspired. The color palette is a bunch of grays and browns with very little variation. The combat mechanics feel more simple in comparison to the other games, and there are less weapons to use. The level design is much weaker, and overall this game just felt like it was 2 steps back. I don't know, I was not feeling this game at all. Up next, we have Immortals of Aveum. Does anyone remember this game? Probably not. The magic FPS with the power of Unreal Engine 5. This game almost feels like a tech demo. Now, there are some cool aspects, specifically around how different spells can be used to spice up the gameplay. There are 3 schools of magic, each one basically representing a different gun type. Green is like using an SMG, blue is like using a rifle, and red is like using a shotgun. Each school of magic has a variety of spells and so on. The reason the game sits where it does on this list is because of the story and the writing, which is basically Marvel tier. It has that quirky vibe to it that was all over the place during that time. But the fact of the matter is, there's a dense world filled with lore here, and some of it is interesting, but the overarching story, it wasn't great at all. It's a short 12-hour playthrough that didn't really have any memorable moments for me. What really was the nail in the coffin for this game, however, was sending it out between Baldur's Gate 3 and Armored Core 6 with a $70 price tag. Yeah, I don't know what EA was thinking. Anyway, it's a solid game, but it is forgettable at best. Up next, we have Gotham Knights. Gotham Knights was a game that I enjoyed more than I thought it would, despite all the problems and all that I had read on the internet. It did a decent job of fulfilling the superhero fantasy, and the characters themselves were interesting enough. The city design was solid, albeit a far cry from what the Batman series had going for it, but the gameplay was decent. I liked the different playstyles between the 4 main characters. The loot grind was okay. The UI, unfortunately, was really bad, but overall the game gave me about 20 hours of fun. I know a lot of people are hard on this game, and rightfully so. The live service aspect of it was scraped, and we were left with the skeleton of what might have been, but we are probably better off that way. There are flashes of a better game, especially when you're patrolling Gotham at night and swapping between the heroes, but it never really escapes the feeling of being pulled in 2 different directions, at least design-wise. Overall, though, I felt like the game was solid. However, it'll always be interesting to me how this game's failure wasn't a huge red flag for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. Up next, we have Biomutant. This was one of those games I always wanted to like more than I actually did. On paper, the concept sounds awesome. A strange post-apocalyptic world. You got mutated animals. You can use martial arts, guns. There's a lot of crafting and vehicles to use, different tribes, and this huge open world filled with these creatures and colorful environments. There's a lot of creativity that went into this game, and I do respect that. The problem is that almost none of it comes together in a way that truly feels great. The combat itself is fine, but it doesn't feel very impactful. The exploration is fine. It can be rewarding with chests hiding in different locations. The progression system is decent, but that's kind of the issue. Everything feels like it's hovering around decent without ever becoming something more memorable. The narrator also becomes pretty annoying after a while, and you can actually turn them off, and they added that setting after a patch. The story itself never gave me a reason to care about what was happening. I did like the art direction, I liked the idea of the world, and I liked a lot of the customization, but the actual moment-to-moment gameplay got pretty old quickly. Biomutant isn't terrible, and I don't think it deserves to be treated like some complete disaster, but it's one of those clear examples of a game with a cool concept that never really reached its full potential. Up next, we have Dead Island 2. Dead Island 2 was a game that came out at the right time. I enjoyed its zombie dismemberment mechanics, the creative weapon design, and the level design. Those were all highlights for me. The combat felt weighty, the hits felt impactful, and those are the few things that really matter to me in a game like this. There's something satisfying about how reactive the zombies actually are. Every hit feels like it's doing what it should be doing. It is kind of over the top, but it's also pretty impressive from a technical standpoint. The issues for me rose around the actual narrative. Of course, the game isn't meant to be taken seriously, and that's exactly what the devs leaned into. It's basically a B-movie script. The game can also get repetitive pretty quickly, and the introduction of guns about halfway through does help in spicing up the gameplay a bit longer, but for many, I can see this game getting boring fast. I ended up finishing the game twice, only because I did end up making 2 videos on it. Up next, we have Mafia 3. Mafia 3 was a real surprise for me. I'd never played the game before. I only ever read the reviews and heard stories about its terrible launch. However, when I actually got my hands on it, I was happy with what I got. I'm not saying the game is great. There's a reason why it's so far down on my list, but it does some things really well. The story was actually better than I expected, the writing and voice work was top tier, and the city of New Bordeaux was beautiful. Where the game, however, began losing steam was in its unbelievably repetitive mission design, asking the player to do the same thing over and over again. Go to this location, kill some bad guys, and rinse and repeat for 20 hours. That repetition is frustrating because everything else around it feels like it deserved a stronger structure. Clay, for example, is a great protagonist. The documentary style presentation animation is unique, and when the game is having those moments, Mafia 3 is genuinely compelling. Had this game been more creative in its mission design, it would definitely be further down this list, but overall, it's still a solid open world game. Up next, we have Dragon Age the Veilguard. This game was a huge disappointment for me, and I'm sure many of you will agree. I bought it on release, hoping to experience something similar to what we had back in the day, but what I ended up being left with was a game that had lost all of its character and identity for a game I hardly recognize. I'm not going to go into detail about everything, as I do have a video doing just that already, but there were still some highlights for me that I felt like allowed the game to come this far down the list. The level design is well done. Some areas actually do look amazing. The combat has its high points, and the gear system is solid. However, what made it worse for me is that I could see pieces of a better game underneath it. The environments, companion abilities, and some combat encounters had promise, but the tone of this game just felt so sanitized and safe that it rarely felt like Dragon Age, at least not the version I wanted. The story was a huge disappointment that made Solus go from the main villain to some side character, and the actual villains in this game are incredibly boring. I don't know, it just completely missed the mark for me. Up next, we have Assassin's Creed Mirage. This was a game I appreciated more for what it was trying to do rather than what it actually ended up being. After years of Assassin's Creed becoming bigger, longer, and more RPG focused, Mirage felt like Ubisoft trying to pull the game back toward its roots. Smaller map, more stealth, and less of the overwhelming checklist design that started to take over the franchise. And to its credit, I did enjoy parts of that. Baghdad was a great setting, the city felt dense, the stealth was solid, and being able to move through rooftops again felt like something the series had been missing for a while. The problem is that it also felt like a game caught between two versions of Assassin's Creed. It wanted to be that classic entry, but it still carried some of that same stiffness and limitations of the newer games. Basim was a fine protagonist, but I never found him really that compelling, and the story didn't really do too much for me. I respect Mirage, however, for being short, tighter, and more focused. Up next, we have Anthem. Anthem is one of those games that is honestly more frustrating than outright terrible, because there's really something here, and I will die on this hill every time. Flying around in a javelin feels incredible. The movement, the verticality, the way you can launch into the sky, dive underwater, and just hover above enemies and rain down abilities, all of that still feels great. The problem is everything that surrounded the core idea just never came together. The mission design was repetitive, the story was forgettable, the loot system wasn't strong enough, and the endgame gave players almost no reason to stick around. For a game that was supposed to be BioWare's big live service moment, it felt unbelievably thin. Every time I played this game, I came away more disappointed than angry. There are pieces of Anthem that still feel better than a lot of games released today, but those pieces are trapped inside of a game that was never properly finished or supported. It deserved better, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore how badly it missed the mark. Anthem was a great concept, but it was buried under poor execution, and that's what makes it such a shame. Up next, we have Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Breakpoint was a game I revisited mostly out of boredom and looking for something fresh to play. I was surprised to see just how many changes the game had undergone, introducing all new gameplay systems and removing a lot of the fluff that was originally added. The game came out with that same looter system you'd see in The Division. Why the devs went that route, however, is a mystery on its own. But as I mentioned, the game has received a bevy of updates, and the experience is far more grounded and more in line with the Ghost Recon franchise. I put around 25 hours into the game, and the freedom that the game gives the players to approach missions how they see fit is one of those highlights. When Breakpoint is working, it does a really good job of making you feel like you're behind enemy lines, you're scouting bases, marking targets, taking out patrols, and slowly clearing an area without anybody knowing you were there. It still has plenty of that Ubisoft bloat that we've all come to know and either love or hate, but the tactical sandbox that is buried underneath it all is genuinely fun to mess around with. Up next, we have Atomic Heart. Atomic Heart is probably one of the strangest games on this entire list, because there are times where it looks and feels like it should be incredible. Don't get me wrong, the presentation is absolutely fantastic, the world itself is interesting, and visually, the game has a very strong identity that we do not see often in other games. It has this weird alt-history Soviet sci-fi setting that immediately stands out. There are moments where the art direction, the music, and the atmosphere really do come together. The problem is that the actual game underneath all of that is a lot more uneven. Combat can be fun, the powers can be cool, and some of the weapons do feel great to use, but the pacing is all over the place. Sometimes it feels like a tight, immersive shooter, and other times it feels like it's doing everything possible to slow itself down. The dialogue also became kind of annoying really fast, and the main character wasn't exactly helping with the experience. And I didn't hate Atomic Heart because there are some really good ideas here, and when it's firing on all those cylinders, it can be really entertaining. But on the flip side, it can be messy and inconsistent. With that being said, it's a game that oozes a lot of style, but it doesn't always back it up. Up next, we have Evil West. This is a game that knows exactly what it is, and I can respect that. It's not trying to be some massive open world RPG, it's not trying to reinvent action games, and it's not trying to waste 60 hours of your life. It's a straightforward, linear third-person action game where there's melee, shooting, and basically just hunting down vampires. The combat is easily the best part of the game. It's fast, it's punchy, and it has a good sense of impact, especially once you start unlocking more abilities and sort of chaining everything together. The setting is also pretty cool, blending that Western element with the supernatural monsters and some steampunk technology. The problem is that the game doesn't have much else going for it beyond that. I've said this about many games on this list, but the story is just forgettable. The characters are fine at best, and the level design is about as basic as it gets. You're mostly moving from arena to arena, fighting groups of enemies, grabbing an upgrade, and then kind of doing it all over again. That being said though, I did have fun with Evil West, but it's one of those games where once the credits rolled, I didn't really feel the need to go back for more. Up next, we have Far Cry 6. Far Cry 6 was a real mixed bag for me for a number of reasons. It wasn't the best entry by far, and a lot of it does feel phoned in. The newly added looter mechanics suffer from the same issues that Ghost Recon Breakpoint did. The simple fact is that they really aren't needed. The traditional skill tree is gone, replaced with abilities tied to your gear. So if I'm being this negative about the game, why do I have it this high on the list? Well, I actually really like the setting. I like the organic feel to gameplay, and the gameplay loop for me was fun enough. Yara is a great playground, and we're just moving through these enemy bases, causing chaos, stealing vehicles, and experimenting with different weapons. The game has that classic Far Cry rhythm that can be easy to get sucked into, and I definitely fell into it. It's just buried under systems that feel like they were added because Ubisoft couldn't help themselves. Eventually, I did start to get bored towards the end game, but that's not surprising because that happens with basically every Ubisoft game, except for one, which is further down the list. I'd be really interested to see where Ubisoft takes the franchise next, as Far Cry is desperately ready for something fresh. Up next, we have the Callisto Protocol. I have a love-hate relationship with this game. I love it for its premise, its atmosphere, its presentation, and its setting. All of that is really top tier. Where things get shaky, however, is the actual gameplay, which unfortunately matters quite a lot. The problems start to mount with the horrible melee systems that make you feel like you're boxing Mike Tyson, the claustrophobic camera that fights with you in tight quarters, and its unfortunately very predictable story. That being said, Black Iron Prison, where the game takes place, is disgusting in the best way. The lighting is fantastic. The sound design is some of the best I've seen in any game, and the creature designs do have that nasty horror sci-fi feel to them, which I like quite a bit. I still like the game quite a lot, hence why it's so high on the list, but every time I play it, I just get sad because of what could have been. It's basically Dead Space, but it does almost everything worse than Dead Space. I do wish we got a sequel to this game, however, it looks like this IP is going to be dormant, probably forever. Up next, we have Vampyr. Vampyr is one of those games that feels rough in a lot of obvious ways, but there's something about it that still managed to stick with me. The premise alone is pretty strong. You play as a doctor who becomes a vampire during a plague-ridden version of London, and that immediately creates this interesting conflict between saving people and feeding on them. The game is at its best when it leans into that idea. Every district that you go through has its own characters, its own problems, illnesses, and connections, and the more you learn about the people within that region, the more valuable their blood becomes. That's a really cool system because it makes every decision you make feel a little more personal rather than just picking good or bad. Where Vampyr struggles is in its combat and general polish. The fighting is fine, I guess, but it never feels amazing, and the game can be clunky in ways that are hard to ignore. Visually, it has that double A look where the atmosphere is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but honestly, I respect this game quite a bit. It has an identity, and even with its problems, it gave me a vampire RPG that felt different from most games that I've played. Up next, we have GreedFall. GreedFall was a game that also surprised me quite a bit, mostly because I went in expecting something much rougher than what I actually got. It definitely has that AA feel to it. You can see the budget limitations in the animations, the combat, and the overall presentation, but there's a lot here that works better than I really thought it would. The setting is easily the strongest part of the game. This colonial fantasy world filled with different factions, there's politics involved, a lot of different monsters, magic, and all this really gives the game a strong identity. And that actually helped me carry through a lot of the weaker moments. I also liked how much of the game leaned into dialogue, different choices you make, and the relationships you have with the different factions. It's not on the level with the best RPGs out there, but it does capture a little bit of that old BioWare feeling, which is probably why so many people latched onto this game. The combat is just okay, the exploration can definitely feel repetitive, and some quests are stronger than others, but I respect GreedFall for what it was trying to be. Up next, we have Watch Dogs Legion. This entry is both good and bad for numerous reasons. It's good because Ubisoft attempted something completely unique. Every person you see in the city is a potentially playable character that you can recruit. This mechanic alone is very interesting. The city of London is also very well designed, lending itself to the emergent gameplay that all Ubisoft titles have. The approach to mission design is well done, allowing for all sorts of different ways to creatively complete your objective. There are moments where the systems actually click, especially when you're using drones or hacking tools and different recruits to approach the same objective in completely different ways. Where the problems begin to crop up, however, is in its narrative. It suffers greatly from not having a single main character. It makes it all just feel so disconnected. What made the first Watch Dogs shine so much for me was playing as Aiden and working through his personal story. Not having that just made me really disinterested. The franchise now has been dormant for a while, but I have a feeling we have not seen the last of the Watch Dogs series. Up next, we have Star Wars Outlaws. It seems like we're in some sort of Ubisoft universe in this list. Outlaws is a decent game. It does some things well, like its world design and overarching plot. It attempts to introduce systems such as the faction's reputation, but that kind of falls flat in my opinion, as there are no real consequences to pissing people off. Kay is also not a character that has much depth. Her backstory and personal story aren't expanded on as much as they needed to be to introduce this new character. It's not all bad though. The skill system is really well done and was a high point for me, mainly how you go about unlocking abilities, and the gameplay is more or less an Assassin's Creed game in a Star Wars universe. The gunplay is super solid to no one's surprise since the game comes from the Division devs. I really wish they leaned more heavily into that aspect of the gameplay. All in all, it's a solid game that does some things good and some things bad. It hasn't had too many updates since its launch, and I'm not sure it'll be getting much more at all, so it's probably safe to say that Ubisoft has moved on from this title. Up next, we have Dying Light 2. Dying Light 2 attempts to expand on the existing Dying Light formula, opening up the map in a big way, adding more districts, more points of interest, and just more things to do. The crafting system is completely overhauled, the gear system allows for build variety and customization. It takes the foundation that the first game laid and builds a whole skyscraper on it. The problem is that it loses some of the soul that made the first game so good. The story, in my opinion, is terrible, and the writing is just really bad. Aiden is also just not a very interesting character. Even the world itself, while much bigger, never felt as tense or memorable as Heron did in the first game, especially when it came to nighttime exploration. The game, however, has received many updates, most of which attempted to bring fans back from the original Dying Light by adding in graphics options that make it look more like the first game. There's also been a slew of additions that I simply cannot cover all in this video, but a lot of them have added a ton of content. All in all, Dying Light 2 is a solid game that has only gotten better over time. Up next, we have Lords of the Fallen. I have this high on the list due to the fact that the developers have continued to build and update this game year after year. The most recent update really overhauled the game and now it's in its most complete state. It's a very solid Souls-like with good level design and some solid combat mechanics and good boss design. What drew me into this game, however, was the art design. It's unique and it's depressing, and that's what I really ended up liking. The whole umbral mechanic is also a big part about what makes this game stand out. Being able to shift between two versions of the world gives exploration more meaning, and even when it does get annoying, I do think it gives the game an identity that a lot of different Souls Souls-like struggle to find. It's not a perfect game, and some encounters still feel a little bit overtuned. Combat can still feel a little bit squishy and non-impactful, which was the primary reason a lot of people didn't like this game to begin with. The animations do still feel a little bit slow, but overall, it's a really solid game. Up next, we have Watch Dogs. The first Watch Dogs is probably my favorite of the bunch. The game introduced a city that was interactive in ways that no other game had ever done before. Aiden's story of vengeance is engaging. I really liked his stoic nature. He's not overly charismatic or overly emotional. The open world is very solid. Chicago is a great playground to play in. The ability to interact with so many different aspects of it was just great. It definitely has a more colder and more grounded tone that I think helps separate it from other Ubisoft games at the time, and even to this day. I do have to give a special shout out to the chase mechanics in this game. I don't think many games have mastered chase mechanics the way Watch Dogs does. When you get chased by police or rival gangs or whatever it is, they will hunt you down. They will chase you until the ends of the earth. Honestly, it's a really solid game and one that I enjoyed from start to finish, and I'd recommend it to anyone looking for a good single-player experience. Up next, we have Darksiders. This was my first real entry point into the series, and honestly, I came away understanding pretty quickly why people still talk about it. It has that late 2000s action-adventure feel in the best way possible. It blends the hack-and-slash combat with dungeon exploration. There's a bunch of puzzles, gear upgrades, and a world that feels bigger than what you would expect. War is a great protagonist for this kind of game. He's not overly complicated. He's not trying to be funny every 5 seconds. He's just this giant, angry horseman trying to prove that he's been betrayed, and that works perfectly. What surprised me most was how much Darksiders felt like a mix of different games without feeling like a cheap copy of them. You can clearly see the Zelda influence in the dungeon design, the God of War influence in the combat, and even a little bit of a Metroidvania structure in how the world opens up over time. It doesn't do all those things perfectly, and some sections definitely feel dated now, but the foundation is very strong. Darksiders does have its rough spots, but personally, I enjoyed this game quite a bit. Up next, we have Far Cry 5. Far Cry 5 is easily one of the more interesting entries in this series for me because there are parts of this game that I think are genuinely great and other parts that drive me a little bit crazy. The setting is probably the biggest highlight. Hope County is beautiful, it's memorable, and it is immediately different from the usual tropical island or foreign war zone that the series had become known for. There's something about being dropped into this rural American cult takeover that gives this game a really strong identity, and it is presented time and time again with how the environment around you is built. The gameplay loop is also classic Far Cry. You're taking outposts, rescuing civilians, hunting animals, causing chaos all over the place. When the game lets you freely explore and stumble into trouble naturally, that's when the game is at its best. Problem with this game is the forced story progression. Being kidnapped over and over again completely kills the open world flow. It makes some of the villains feel less intimidating and more annoying after a while. That being said, I really like Joseph Seed as a villain. I thought he was compelling, and every time he was on screen, I knew it was going to be good. Overall, I really like the atmosphere of this game, and I also enjoy the open world design. Far Cry 5 is a very solid game, and in my opinion, one of the more memorable Ubisoft entries. Up next, we have Assassin's Creed Shadows. The latest entry definitely caused some controversy for its selection of characters, but there are some things about this game that I did enjoy quite a lot. Japan as a setting looks beautiful, and as always, Ubisoft nails the world design. I like the stealth mechanics as well, bringing back some aspects previously taken away. And as far as the parkour goes, it's not as good as some of the series' older titles, but it's definitely better than what we got through the Mythology series. The combat is as good as it's ever been, really leveling up the foundation that Valhalla placed and refining it in every way possible, providing what I think is the smoothest combat experience that the series has ever seen. They also stripped away a lot of the bloat that players complained about in Valhalla, leaving us with a more refined experience that was sorely needed. The dual main character thing isn't something I really enjoyed in this game, and Yasuke's playstyle was not particularly fitting of an Assassin's Creed game, but overall, it's a good game that did what it needed to do. Up next, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor. This was a game I enjoyed quite a bit, even if I don't think it reached the level that it probably could have. It takes takes the foundation of Fallen Order and expands on it in basically every direction. There's bigger planets, more customization, an additional combat stance, and more side content. The game does feel like it's one of the better modern Star Wars experiences. The combat is easily one of the highlights. Being able to swap between different lightsaber stances gives the game more variety. The exploration is also better, especially on Kobo, which almost feels like a hub world filled with a ton of secrets, side paths, and optional bosses. The problem with the game is that it still has those pacing issues. At launch, the performance problems were hard to ignore. A lot of the performance issues have been addressed. However, there are reports that high-end GPUs still struggle with this game for some reason. Overall, in my opinion, Jedi Survivor is a strong sequel and a game that I'm glad I finished. And I know this is going to be a trilogy, so I'm really hoping the third game in the series really takes it up to another level that we haven't seen in these first two games. Up next, we have Saros. Saros was a game I was really looking forward to, mostly because of how much I enjoyed Returnal. That game set such a high bar for me. The atmosphere, the movement, and the pure moment-to-moment gameplay was absolutely amazing. Saros still has a lot of that DNA. The combat is very fast, the visuals are striking, but the problem is that, at least for me, it just didn't hit quite as hard as Returnal. Returnal had this really big mystery to it. You're all alone in this world, and it felt like everything was constantly working against you, but every run felt like you're peeling back another layer of something that is much bigger. Saros is still very good, and I enjoyed my time with it, but it didn't have the exact same pull. Truthfully, I was expecting something a lot more, at least in terms of the improvements, maybe the addition of new mechanics outside of a parry system, more weapons, more upgrades to use, but it doesn't really have much of any of that. The gameplay is still very strong, the presentation is great, and the core loop works just like it did with Returnal, but it never fully reached that special place that Returnal did for me. Up next, we have Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora. This is one of those games where the world itself is the star of the show. Pandora looks absolutely incredible, and I don't think there's any way around that. Colors, the scale, the force, the creatures, the way the environment reacts around you, all of it helps sell a fantasy of actually being inside this world. If you're someone who loves the Avatar movies and just wants to exist in that world, this game does a pretty good job of giving you that. However, it does get a little bit more complicated with that, especially when you consider the actual structure underneath it all. At the end of the day, it is still a Ubisoft open world game, and you can feel that pretty quickly. You're going to be clearing outposts, gathering materials, upgrading gear, helping different clans, and slowly working your way across the map. Of course, a lot of that is going to work because Pandora is just visually impressive, but some of it does start to feel familiar in a way that does hold the game back at times. The movement is fun, the combat does have its moments as well, and that third-person update changed the game completely for me. I had to go back to it because of that new patch, and I ended up playing the game from start to finish. I enjoyed this game more than I expected, and there's definitely enough here to make it a very solid experience. Up next, we have Darksiders Genesis. This was a pretty interesting change of pace for the series, and honestly, I think it worked a lot better than people expected. Genesis shifts everything into a top-down perspective while still keeping a lot of what makes Darksiders feel like a Darksiders game. You still have dungeons, you have puzzles, you have upgrades, combat arenas, boss fights, basically all the good stuff that we've come to know and love. What really helps this game, however, for me, was the dynamic between the two horsemen, War and Strife. War is still that stoic, angry, straightforward horseman, while Strife brings a little bit more personality and humor to the story. Being able to swap between the two at any given moment gives the combat more variety, War handling the heavier melee side and Strife focusing more on range attacks. It's not my favorite game in the series, but I had a really good time with it. Genesis does feel like a side entry, but it's definitely not a throwaway one. It's a fun, creative spin on Darksiders that I thoroughly enjoyed. Up next, we have Starfield. Starfield is one of those games that I had a really complicated time with because I don't think it's nearly as bad as some people make it out to be, but I also don't think it came anywhere close to what it probably should have been. There are things I genuinely like here. I like the shipbuilding, I like some of the faction quest lines, I like the overall NASA visual style, and I like the idea of Bethesda trying to make a massive space RPG. That's right up my alley. The problem is that so much of Starfield feels disconnected. You're jumping from planet to planet, menu to menu, and just going through loading screens, and it starts to make the universe feel smaller than it actually is. Exploration, which should be the heart of the game, often feels flat because so many planets are empty or filled with repeated points of interest. Now, I should add that Bethesda has released a Starfield update, which really addresses some of the lack of points of interest. It makes exploration more rewarding overall, but when Starfield really focuses in on the crafted quests, it can feel really enjoyable. One of the biggest problems for me, however, is that the main quest is just so bland and boring that it almost feels like the faction quests are the main quests. Regardless, I had fun with the game. I don't think I would ever go back to it, but it did scratch my space RPG itch. Up next, we have Dragon Age Inquisition. This was a game I went back to mostly because of Veilguard, and honestly, revisiting it made me appreciate certain parts of it a lot more. Inquisition is not perfect by any means, and I do think it suffers a lot from that mid-2010s open world design where every area is filled with way too many icons, camps, rifts, and things to collect. Some zones feel stretched far beyond what they ever needed to be, and the game can lose momentum when it leans too heavily into that open world busy work, and we all know the meme about the hinterlands. But underneath it all, there's a really strong RPG here. The world, the politics, the companions, and the larger thread all feel much more in line with what I want from Dragon Age. I liked building the Inquisition, making decisions, judging characters, and slowly becoming this major political force in Thedas. The combat is pretty hit or miss, and I don't think every zone needed to be as large as it was, but the game has a scope in a way that still feels impressive. It really does feel like a big fantasy adventure with actual stakes. There's strong companions and a world worth taking time to explore. Even with its bloat, Inquisition reminded me why I like Dragon Age to begin with. At this point, these are some of the best games I've played on this channel, and it was kind of hard to place some of these, but here we go. Up next, we have Metro Exodus, one of my personal favorites. That's why it's so high on this list. The immersive gameplay, the sound design, the animations, and level design all help in crafting a game that is really one of a kind. It takes the existing formula and expands on it by placing Artyom in these semi-open world areas filled with secrets, side missions, and rewards to find. It doesn't ever overstep. Despite being bigger, it never tries to pad its runtime. Each area that you visit feels distinct, from the frozen ruins near Moscow to the desert and forest sections later on. The game constantly changes the tone and environment without ever losing the Metro identity, and that's something I really appreciated. It feels larger overall, but it's still very focused and deliberate. The main story is engaging, though some questionable design decisions exist in the morale system. The gunplay is solid and the weapon mechanics help with the immersion. The game falters a bit with its AI. They honestly just seem pretty dumb more often than not, but overall the game is very solid and my favorite in the Metro series. Up next, we have Darksiders 2. This is easily my favorite game in the series, and honestly, it's the one where I think the formula came together the best. The first Darksiders laid a really solid foundation, but Darksiders 2 expands on almost everything. The world is bigger, the combat is faster, there's a loot system that gives you more reason to keep pushing forward, and Death is just a great protagonist. War worked because he was this angry force of nature, but Death has a little bit more personality to him, and I think that helped carry the game a lot more for me. What I really liked about Darksiders 2 was how much more adventurous it felt. You're moving through these massive areas, solving puzzles, clearing dungeons, fighting bosses left and right, collecting gear, and constantly getting stronger. It has this action RPG structure that made the game feel more rewarding than the first one without completely losing the Darksiders identity. Not every area in this game is perfect, and I do think it can drag a bit in spots, but when it's at its best, it is easily the strongest entry in the franchise. Up next, we have Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. I absolutely love the campaign in this game. It's epic, it's cinematic, and it's intense. The level and world design is beautiful, and the game impresses in quite literally every aspect. It does a great job of selling the scale of the universe. Battles feel massive, the Tyranid swarms feel overwhelming, and playing as Titus gives the game that same power fantasy that the first game was built around. It's pretty simple in its structure, but extremely effective in its execution. When the game first launched, it was pretty light on content, but that's been expanded on quite a bit since its 2.0 launch, adding a wave-based mode, new weapons, and new operations generations. The game just continues to get better with time as Saber continues to push out more updates, and this is a game that I really enjoyed. Up next, we have Mandragora. This is a game that took me by complete surprise. It's a 3D Souls-like side-scroller that really impressed me in a number of ways. Graphically, it's impressive. The art style is great and unique. However, what I really liked was the build crafting with these large skill trees. The game gives you the option between a number of starting classes that you're not tied down to. The flexibility is what keeps the game interesting to me. You're constantly finding new ways to shape your character, whether that's through the weapons, the armor, the abilities, or different upgrades, and it gives the game a lot more depth than I was ever expecting from a side scroller. There's so much more going on with this game that I really enjoyed, and I did get about 30 hours of playtime, and it was well worth the price. Up next, we have Ghost of Yotei. This game takes Tsushima and multiplies it by 2. Everything is bigger, better, and more refined. Visually, it's gorgeous, and the gameplay loop does feel different from Tsushima. You feel less railroaded onto the story and more free to go and explore anything and everything from the side missions, the activities, and the different tales. What I really liked is how much more natural the exploration felt. Instead of feeling like I was just clearing icons off a map, I felt more encouraged to just follow the world, get distracted, and let the journey unfold at its own pace. The combat does feel a little bit sharper, with more options and a stronger sense of impact, which does help in keeping this larger structure that the game has become from becoming tiring. The setting of feudal Japan is fun to explore, and there's no shortage of things to do. Of course, completing this game is a huge time sink, but thankfully it's one that is pretty fun. Up next, we have Monster Hunter Wilds. This is a game I actually ended up enjoying quite a bit. I can understand why it's been divisive among longtime Monster Hunter fans. Wilds is much more faster, more streamlined, and more approachable than some of the older entries. Instead of spending as much time tracking monsters, learning their routes, and slowly building up the hunt, the game gets you right into the action much quicker, and for some people that takes away part of what made Monster Hunter feel special, but for me, I didn't really mind that approach. The combat, of course, is still the main reason to play, learning your weapon, reading monster patterns, finding openings, and slowly getting better at each fight is incredibly satisfying. The world itself also feels more alive with larger environments and more dynamic moments happening during the hunts. My biggest issue is the difficulty. I made my way through the story pretty easily, and I do think the game loses some tension when that challenge isn't really pushing back. The end game does seem to address that with higher tier monsters, but overall, Monster Hunter Wilds is still a very strong entry and one that I had a good time with. Up next, we have Dying Light. This is one of those games that still holds up incredibly well, and honestly, going back to it made me appreciate it even more. The parkour, the combat, the atmosphere, and the day-night cycle all work together in a way that still feels really effective. Heron is such a strong setting because it feels dangerous, it's desperate, it's clearly lived in. During the day, you're scavenging, you're climbing these rooftops, helping survivors, and slowly building up confidence and understanding how to navigate the world. But when night comes around, the entire game changes. That's where Dying Light really separates itself. The volatiles are still terrifying, and the simple act of trying to get back to a safe zone can turn into one of the most stressful moments. The story, I'll admit, isn't amazing, and Kyle Crane isn't the deepest protagonist in the world, but the gameplay loop is still so strong that it almost doesn't matter. The movement feels great, the melee combat is brutal, and the progression makes you feel like you're slowly becoming more capable without ever completely removing the danger. Dying Light is easily one of the best zombie games I've played, and it's a game that I still think people should go back to and try out. Up next, we have Dying Light The Beast. In my opinion, this is the sequel we were always supposed to get. It reverses course on some additions made in Dying Light 2, stripping away the grind and over-engineering of its crafting system and introducing a more streamlined approach. It also introduces a unique setting that lends itself perfectly to a world filled with infected. The night is scary once again, which is one of the biggest complaints stemming from Dying Light 2. Crane is also back and plays his role just as well as he did in the first one. The combat and dismemberment is as good as the series has ever been, and Crane's new abilities that are tied to his mutations are a great addition. Overall, it just feels more focused, feels more aggressive, and more in line with what made the original game work so well. In my opinion, the redesigned skill system, however, is a bit unneeded, but it does take away some of the grind from the previous games. However, overall from me, it's all positive in terms of Dying Light the Beast, and that's why it's one of my favorite games on this list. Up next, we have Assassin's Creed Origins. Why on earth is an AC game so high on this list? Honestly, I love AC Origins. I love its setting, I love its world design, and I found Bayek to be a really good main character. His quest for vengeance is thrilling, and how it all comes together was something that I really liked. Now, truthfully, the combat is just okay. It's the first game in the redesigned series, so it doesn't do anything special. Stealth is also solid enough, and the parkour is fine, I guess. But despite all that, what kept me going was the world itself. I absolutely love ancient Egypt as a setting, and exploring it never felt overwhelming, something that unfortunately the series becomes in later titles. There is a sense of discovery here that feels much more natural than forced, and the game does a great job of making Egypt feel vast. It's not the first time I played through the game, and when I replay a game, there's usually a good reason for it. For me, AC Origins still stands as one of the strongest entries in the series, and one of the few newer Assassin's Creed games that understood the balance between scale, story, and exploration. Up next, we have The Division. This is a game that has aged a lot better than I expected, mostly because the atmosphere is still incredible. There's something about New York covered in snow with the abandoned streets. There's Christmas decorations still hanging around, but the entire city feels like it collapsed overnight. It has one of the strongest settings Ubisoft has ever built, and even now it still feels distinct in a way that a lot of other games do not. The gameplay is also still very solid. It's a cover-based looter shooter, and while that can sound repetitive on paper, the loop of clearing missions, upgrading your gear, and pushing into harder areas while slowly improving your build is still very satisfying. The Dark Zone is probably the most memorable part of the game, even though it can be frustrating, but that tension of not knowing if another player is going to help you or completely ruin your run gives The Division a nice personality. It's not a perfect game, and some of the bullet sponge combat can still feel a little bit annoying, but the setting, the atmosphere, and the progression loop carried it a long way for me. Up next, we have Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. This game was also a surprise. It's drawn many comparisons to Skyrim, and rightfully so. It does many things well. The skill system is great, where certain abilities level the more you use them. The quest design is solid and interesting. There are many secrets hiding in every crevice of the map. The choices you make do affect the outcome, whether who lives, who dies, and how the world shapes itself. The world itself is engaging. It's an original setting that builds on Arthurian mythology. Combat changes based on your playstyle. You're not locked into a single archetype. You can easily switch between a magic wielder or using a two-handed sword and everything in between. The game is just chock full of content, and I love the game for what it was, a fantasy RPG that lets you play however you want and do whatever you want. I look forward to what else this studio has to offer. Up next, we have The Division 2. While I still think the first game has a better atmosphere, The Division 2 is the better game mechanically. It takes that cover-based looter-shooter foundation and expands on it in almost every direction. The enemy factions are more interesting to fight, and the endgame gives you a lot more to actually chase. Washington, D.C. doesn't have that same magic as the snowy New York setting, but it does give the game a different feel with more open environments and a stronger sense of verticality in certain areas. What really stood out to me was how much content the game has now. There are missions, strongholds, control points, seasons, gear sets, exotics, specializations, and a ridiculous amount of ways to fine-tune your character. It can definitely be overwhelming at first, so I definitely would suggest looking up a guide once you make it to the end game. But once you do get that down, the game really opens up. The Division 2 is one of those games where the more time you put into it, the more rewarding it becomes. It's not perfect, and of course it does have that Ubisoft grind baked into it, but as a looter shooter, it's one of the strongest in the genre. Up next, we have Spider-Man 2. While not a series redefining sequel, I feel like it improved on the original in ways that were needed. The web swinging saw an upgrade, the city is more lively and engaging, the graphics are absolutely beautiful with ray tracing, and there are a wide variety of side activities to do. The story is solid, introducing villains like Sandman, Kraven, Lizard, and more. Kraven is a bit of a controversial villain, mainly because he doesn't really have the star power of other villains. Regardless, I enjoyed the dual character story. Switching between Peter and Miles seamlessly and their different playstyles and abilities was a really good time. I'm very excited to see how the game evolves in the next chapter because I can't see Insomniac making another incremental upgrade, which is kind of how I felt Spider-Man 2 was overall. The third title really needs to introduce some new mechanics and systems that we haven't seen before in the series, but I still really enjoyed Spider-Man 2 quite a lot. Up next, we have Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 was genuinely terrifying, and it's no secret that I do not do well with horror games. I can watch horror movies all day long and not blink, but there's definitely something different when I'm in control. That being said, Alan Wake 2 does so many things really, really well. The world design, the story, the writing, and everything in between. I will say that there isn't a huge amount of depth to combat, but it's not the combat that makes this game as good as it is. It's how the story unfolds, slowly peeling back more and more and revealing what's actually taking place. Saga is a great character, and her mind place mechanic was really well done, allowing you to freely review and interact with what's taking place. Alan Wake 2 was a game that had trouble getting funded, but I'm really glad it did, as it became one of my favorite games. Up next, we have Remnant 2. This is one of those games that I didn't fully understand until I really started digging into it. On the surface, it's a third-person shooter with Souls-like elements, but the more you play, the more you realize how much is actually going on underneath. The worlds are randomized, the bosses can change, quest lines can play out differently, and there are secrets hidden behind secrets. It's the kind of game where you can finish an entire area and still have no idea how much you actually missed. The combat is a highlight, the gunplay feels great, the boss fights are intense, and the build crafting gives the game a ridiculous amount of replay value. Archetypes, weapons, rings, amulets, mods, and traits, all of that feeds into this loop of constantly finding new ways to play. I also liked how crazy the world design gets in this game. One minute you're fighting through a ruined fantasy kingdom, the next minute you're dealing with alien machines or some really weird hidden puzzle that will take you forever to solve. Remnant 2 is a dense game. However, it's rewarding and one of the better games I've played in a long time. Up next, we have Black Myth Wukong, an epic journey that I didn't play through just once, but twice. A long adventure that I thoroughly enjoyed. What makes the game great to me is twofold. Firstly, the impressive and unique boss designs that present a satisfying challenge, and the game isn't easy. It asks for your patience, it asks you to take a step back and learn when fights start to seem impossible. Going in headstrong into fights will only ever lead to your demise. The world design is fantastic in ways that I never expected. It follows the same logic of the Soul series. It's very obtuse in its direction and side quests. There are so many hidden paths and areas that also have their own bosses and characters within them. It's a large game that demands your time, but in the best way possible. It doesn't waste your time, and there's very little fluff. The moment-to-moment gameplay is engaging, and while there are a few downsides, none of them outweigh what makes the game as great as it is. I cannot wait for the next game in this franchise. Up next, we have Prey. Prey is the kind of game that reminds me why Arcane was such a special studio. It doesn't hold your hand, it doesn't force you down one specific path, and it doesn't treat the player like they need every solution explained to them. You're dropped onto Tylos 1, this massive space station filled with secrets, threats, locked doors, hidden pathways. The deeper I got into it, the more I started to appreciate how carefully everything about this game was designed. What makes Prey so good is the freedom that it grants you. You can hack your way through problems, or you can sneak around enemies, use powers, stack objects, find alternate routes, or just brute force your way through if you have the resources. The mimics are a cool enemy type because they make you question every room you walk into. A coffee mug or chair or some random object sitting in the corner could be something waiting to attack you. The story is strong, the atmosphere is excellent. Prey didn't get the attention that it deserved when it released, but it absolutely deserved better, and it's one of the best games I've ever played. Up next, we have Dragon's Dogma 2. If this list wasn't already controversial, then this will likely cause that spark. I love Dragon's Dogma 2. A lot. It felt like the perfect adventure game to me and something I sorely needed. A large map that can be freely explored, secrets hidden around every corner, explorable dungeons with treasures, and so much more. My favorite thing about this game was the emergent gameplay. There's really no limit to what can happen at any given time. A griffin can land and start an insane fight, ogres throw boulders and cause all sorts of chaos, and so much more. It's the unscripted moments in this game that kept me coming back for more. It's a playground that offers so much freedom, and I would veer so far off the main quest that I would often forget what I was supposed to be doing. To me, it's a game that I can just get lost in over and over again. There were just so many high points that the lackluster narrative barely affected my enjoyment. It's too bad that Capcom has all but abandoned this game because there's still so much potential for this world, these systems, and this style of adventure to be expanded further. Up next, we have Crimson Desert. This is one of those games that almost feels too ambitious for its own good, but somehow that ambition is exactly what made it so memorable for me. It throws so much at you. Massive battles, open world exploration, melee combat, climbing, horseback riding, these massive set pieces. The open world is by far one of the best I've experienced in any game. There's so many secrets to find, and it's one of those games where I just found myself time and time again exploring the world without really any goal. I would go up a mountain to see what's up there. I would veer off the main path to look for caves or side dungeons to see what's hiding. And this game is just so chock full of these secrets that it really rewards a player's curiosity. I really do have a tough time explaining what I liked about this game because there's just so much to it that I enjoy. There are some downsides, like the controls being so finicky at the start, and there is a learning curve to it, despite what players will say. But once you get the controls down and the world opens up to you, this game is just limitless. It's a game that I can spend hundreds of hours in and still find new things to do in it. It's unfortunate how this game was received critically. The mainstream media didn't seem to love it as much as the players do, but it is what it is. Crimson Desert is one of my favorite games of all time, and it has earned its spot on this list. And finally, at number 1, we have Subnautica. I went into this game as someone who never really understood the hype. From the outside looking in, it just seemed like a survival game where you swim around, collect materials, catch fish, and slowly build better equipment. I didn't really get what made people talk about it like it was some unforgettable masterpiece. Then I actually played it, and yeah, I was completely wrong. What makes Subnautica special is how naturally everything unfolds. There are no cutscenes, there is no endless dialogue, it just drops you into this alien ocean and lets your curiosity do most of the work. I started off scared to leave the life pod. Then before I know it, I'm building bases, I'm diving deeper, I'm exploring the wrecks, following radio signals, discovering abandoned life pods, and slowly realizing there's so much more happening beneath the surface. The deeper you go, the more the game changes. It goes from survival to mystery to horror to full-on discovery. The atmosphere is incredible, the progression is extremely satisfying, and that sense of fear and wonder is something very few games can ever pull off. Subnautica is not just a great survival game, it's one of the most memorable experiences I've had with any game. So that wraps up my list. That is 57 games I have cleared from my backlog and played on this channel. I know this list will be a little bit controversial, so feel free to share your opinion in the comments. And also feel free to share your own list in the comments below as well. And honestly, I cannot wait to see what this is going to look like when there are 100 games on this list. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.